Recently started reading a novel by Vladimir Nabokov called Pale Fire. And Vladimir Nabokov, of course, he's one of my favorite writers. He's very talented. Um, and as far as I can tell, I'm slowly gaining an understanding of the book as I'm reading it, as I go along. It's a very kind of it's a complex story. And as what I can gather so far is that Kinboat, the narrator of the story, is commenting on the work, or the poetic works, I should say, of John Shade, who was a fictional poet that Vladimir Nabokov had made up. It's all fictional. And one of the poems that John Shade writes is called Pale Fire, which sort of sets, of course, the precedent for the rest of the novel. And Pale Fire is very heavy with the sort of metaphysical kind of symbolism and philosophical questions about the afterlife and one thing that I remember very distinctly is the part of the poem where John Shade, and this is now John Shade speaking, that is the narrator temporarily speaking from his perspective, raising a lot of questions about the afterlife because he has attended a lot of lectures talking about it, and the problem that he has, this is very interesting, is that he thinks that many people reduce the concept of an afterlife to what he calls a domestic ghost, which is something very, as you can imagine from hearing it, almost very pedestrian sounding, very ordinary, very lacking in any beauty, very very bleak, very depressing, and naturally creating either a sense of dread, a sense of fear, or a sense of perhaps maybe indifference in some people, a gloom, depending on who you're talking to, but whereas John Shade, what he's suggesting is that perhaps there could be something much wilder, much more grand, much better, and he uses these different images, or these different things that come up in his mind as he's imagining what the afterlife would be like being able to speak with the different philosophers, and seeing angels with flamingo wings, and but I think, and another experience that John Shade had in his childhood that he writes about in his poem is that when he had, I think it was a seizure that caused him to have a near-death experience where he saw a white fountain. So these things in particular are examples of things that I personally, as a writer, I'm still struggling with, because I think that whenever, at least the way that it's always felt for me, is that whenever I approach things like writing about dream sequences or visionary experiences or things of that nature, there's this quote that's always popped into my head, which I think it really illustrates my own struggle, which I think it was Rilke, one of the German poets, had said it, like when he was giving advice to a young poet, he said, to avoid writing love poems because it takes a fully matured power to be able to make something of your own out of it. And I've always felt the same way when I'm approaching things of this type of genre, dream sequences and writing about visions in fiction, because it could be very easy. I think I still do it anyway. I mean, I still break that rule because I want to get it right. But I recognize that struggle, and I see like I can draw some parallels, I think, with what Rilke was talking about when it comes to love poems, because it can be, I think, it could be difficult for me when I'm approaching the subjects to make something of my own, to find my own voice, which is something I'm slowly doing, and because sometimes I think when I've written about these visions and stuff in the past, it can sometimes be drenched in symbolism or be a bit awkward, or sometimes simply dull, or like with having dots that sometimes don't connect. I think there was one example I remember I wrote it was a dream sequence in the second volume of the book series that I've been working on. It's the dream actually was set. It was actually the dream was in an opera. It was the opera was called The Duke of Devonshire. That is written by this famous composer living in the Victorian era named Edmund in the novel, and Peter the Duke, the title role in the opera, has a dream in which he's lying in his own room, his attic, and at night, middle of the night, and when the clock strikes 3, this priestess named Viola, who he's befriended, shows up in his bedroom, and they have this sort of playful exchange and interaction. And then suddenly they hear a chorus outside, and then they go out, they look out the window, and they see these haggard, it looks like these haggard choir boys who have been traveling for a really long time, and now they're all feasting on this long table, and Viola says, "Well, why don't we go join them?" And then the ghost of the king stops them and says, "Well, paradise is forbidden to those with unfinished business." And then the dream slowly that's when it very quickly becomes a nightmare in which Peter wakes up. But that was an example of a dream sequence that's kind of a work in progress, where it's very heavily drenched in symbolism and mystery, but it's sometimes with dots that don't really connect quite. They're a little bit weak, like going from this sort of almost childlike exchange with this woman, and it makes their relationship very ambiguous. You're not even sure really what their relationship is, and then suddenly the chorus and everything. But I've sort of slowly been taking a stab at it more and more, and kind of refining that skill. Whereas when I look at, and I think I've been learning a lot of that skill from Nabokov, because he's kind of a master at being able to tackle that kind of subject. As I see, and I think a lot of Russian literature and writing in particular. The book is actually, Pale Flower is written in English, but there's still the Russian, of course, cultural mindset that goes into writing it. Of course, and specifically what I think about often is the white fountain vision that I mentioned. It's simple, it's compact, it's not convoluted, there's nothing, it's not drenched in symbolism or abstraction. It's very clear, and it gives you a lot to think about. And that's really it's that pithiness. It's that something that I strive for. There's something else I was going to mention as well. And of course the technique. I mean, the writing in the novel is beautiful. I mean, it's amazing. It's certainly something that I'm also learning a lot from. Being able to get a handle on just my own prose and my use of my own use of language, and I think that, as I think I probably mentioned before on my other videos, that since I'm writing in the science fiction genre, sometimes dream sequences, it's hard to weave them sort of seamlessly into that genre, because we generally think of science fiction as being more gritty. And I think to some extent, that's the fault of certain writers, like even as great as Orwell is. And I've been thinking about this, like in, the book 1984. I would say 1984, even that has its limitations, I think, because it gives you, of course, the gloomy depiction of the future. It doesn't really, of course, offer a solution. It almost seems a bit like predictive programming in that sense. But I think that in terms of my own genre of science fiction, I'm sort of trying to introduce another side of reality, which is the more utopian, the more magical, and that's kind of where the dream sequences come into play. And that sort of interplay between the spiritual realm and the human realm. So I don't want to just leave behind the fairy tales, all the ancient stuff that we think are superstitious. I want to sort of integrate that in, but not make it look seamless, make it not be awkward. And I think that reading Pale Fire is kind of giving me some clues about how to do that a little bit better, make it less awkward.